All right, I want to, in this video, unpack a little bit of the biopsychosocial perspectives on what causes these eating disorders, particularly anorexia and bulimia. And I want to start with the biological factors. So I think when people think about eating disorders, oftentimes they really emphasize how culture shapes us. And you'll see in a few slides that culture does play a huge part in this, but I think sometimes people overlook the fact that there is biological factors at play with eating disorders. So we know that there's a hereditary tendency. Eating disorders runs in families, and um, of course that could be nurture because parents do have an effect on their kids, but there's the thought that this is a genetic predisposition that some people have. The second biological, and this is a theory that has been tested and looked at. It's called set point theory, and maybe this will be helpful not just for understanding eating disorders, but maybe in your own challenges, perhaps with your weight. Maybe this is a helpful thing to know. This is again a theory, but it's got a pretty good amount of data to back it up, that somehow our body physiologically can maintain a certain set point in our weight. And so there's this, you've probably heard the idea of homeostasis, right? We try to keep our temperature at, a certain warmth, 98.7 degrees. And so if we are running hot, our body sort of slows down the metabolism, cools us down. If it's getting cold, it kicks it up and kind of makes us, stay reasonably even on our temperature. And the set point theory says that when our bodies decrease too far in terms of weight, our physiology kicks in and gets us to bounce back and increase our weight back to that set point. So if we are trying to diet, we can lower our weight for a time, but the set point theory says when we get too far away from the weight that we were set at, we can actually, our bodies can kick in this hunger that will lead us to overeat and sort of get back to the set point. So when you think about, again, people with eating disorders, the struggle they would have is that they might be trying to lose weight, trying to decrease it, but what they'll likely encounter is that if they get too far from their set point weight, their bodies will react and release hormones that will make them intensely hungry and will make them want to eat. And again, that'll be a very hard thing for them to resist. And so, so that's one biological explanation for these eating disorders is because it's a constant battle between what the psychosocial is trying to achieve and what the biology is capable of doing. All right, so we also know that there's brain abnormalities with eating disorders, and serotonin seems to play a part because we know serotonin is involved in eating, and it seems to have some irregularities with eating disorders. Okay, now secondly, okay, we talked about the biological, let's talk about the psychological. What contributes, what causes people that develop eating disorders? Again, we're focusing on anorexia and bulimia. Well, one of them is a pressure to be thin. And it goes alongside with the second bullet point, the internalization of the thin ideal. So the thin ideal is the culturally prescribed idea of how our bodies should look like. And this is particularly true of female bodies, that that culture has taught that the ideal body frame, body shape is thin. And if that person internalizes that belief that my ideal body shape is to be thin, then that is going to lead them to uh, to be more inclined to eating disorder behaviors. Um, and as you might imagine, if they've internalized a thin ideal, but they don't have a thin body shape, that could create body dissatisfaction, where the person says, I don't have what I think is the ideal body shape. And so they feel dissatisfied with their body. We know that's a risk factor. Um, Alongside that, so all three of these kind of go together. We know that people with eating disorders often have perfectionistic traits. So they might do their schoolwork in a perfectionistic way. They might, just go about their lives and feel like they have to be perfect in everything they do. And one of the things that you can apply that to, you can have a perfectionistic attitude towards the way you eat. So if you feel like you must eat a certain way, in terms of the number of calories or food groups or whatever it might be, that can contribute to this pattern of eating disordered behaviors, of the restriction and control, and being very uh, micromanaging your eating patterns. So that, again, can be a risk factor. If you recall, though, I also mentioned that starvation seems to make people more perfectionistic. So you always have to keep this in mind. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? So does perfectionism come first and lead to eating disorders, or do eating disorders make the person perfectionistic? Well, in this case, it probably is both. That perfectionism seems to contribute to the person's risk factor of having a eating disorder, and then once they have an eating disorder, it seems to make them more perfectionistic. Then we have dieting. I want to be clear as I say this, but also be compassionate, because I know many of you watching this have dieted. The thing to know about diets is that calorie restrictive diets, those that are focused on losing weight, and again, that's probably most diets, but not all, those type of dieting plans tend to put a person at risk of eating disorders. So if you've in your lifetime been on more than one diet, your likelihood of having an eating disorder is much higher. So the thought is, again, this sort of going back to the set point theory, as you try to lose weight, as you try to restrict how much you eat, oftentimes there's a rebound effect and the person becomes very hungry. And unfortunately, that creates this cycle of trying to make more and more efforts to lose weight, which makes your body react even stronger towards that binge eating, because the hunger can get so intense. So I encourage all of you to really be cautious about dieting in ways that are restrictive in terms of calories. Again, it's fine to have diets where you're trying to promote types of eating, or just balance eating. Obviously, that's a good thing for us to do, to try to eat well. But be careful if your end goal is trying to lose weight. All right, so this next one, negative emotionality. People who have high neuroticism, that's another word for this negative emotionality. If they have a tendency to feel depressed, anxious, angry, irritable, those kind of negative emotions, we know that goes alongside eating disorders. And there is some debate, you can read about this in your book, about whether there's a link between childhood sexual abuse and eating disorders. Okay, so the socioculture, again, we appreciate the biology, we appreciate the psychology, we also appreciate the sociocultural influences. And this, again, is probably where we mostly turn when we think about eating disorders, because we know that in the media, thinness is held up as the ideal. Now, I would say that in the last 10, 15 years, this is less so. I guess when I grew up in the 80s and 90s, it was more true that thinness was held up as this perfect body, so the Barbie body, and yet I think there's been some progress towards a greater acceptance of diverse bodies, and I think that's a very good thing. And yet it seems that the society still holds for women in particular, the ideal of a thin body shape as best. Now again, there's lots of variability in terms of um, different uh, particular people who have other body types that are attractive and held up as attractive, but the, um, the majority one, the one that has held in our cultural consciousness, is the thin ideal. So again, the Barbie shape. Is a Barbie body even possible? Well, they have different ratios here that kind of indicate no. It's uh, girls grow up playing with Barbies, many of them, and it's a body shape that is just impossible for girls. So it's just vastly different for the forearms, the hips, 29-inch versus US average of 40 inch. So for most people, this is an impossible ideal, and it sets people up for body dissatisfaction. Again, these socio-cultural factors play back into the psychology, right? They inform us about what's desirable and attractive and what is at play, but our psychology is what processes those sociocultural messages, internalizes it, and then turns it into behavior. And so, again, I think when we're thinking about eating disorders, just want to encourage you to think about it holistically. Don't neglect the bio and psychosocial, perspectives, and only look at the social. So consider it all together.